Lots of people are commenting on social media at the moment about the comment or YouTube geopolitics channels. I was asked myself on the Jamal Thomas show last week. Big shout out to Jamal if you're listening. Whether Australia will go to war with China on behalf of the United States over the issue of Taiwan, or as I was saying earlier, really over the issue of the presence of United States military throughout the Western Pacific. And my initial response to Jamal was, no, I don't think so. I just can't believe people would be that stupid. And there's been quite a bit of discussion about that. I know both Carl Jar and KJ No commented, I think, in the same live stream with Jamal about the same question. And indeed, Warwick Powell has been talking about it with KJ No and Brian Beletic over at the Breakthrough News China report over the last day or so. And that's an opportune time, I guess, to bring in my guest, Warwick Powell, who I'll just add to stage here. Hello, Warwick, can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear. Can you hear me?
I can hear you really well. This is a bit of a new format for me. You're very welcome back to the show, Warwick. It's great to have you back. This is my first live stream interview, so I'm learning from Jamal Thomas in real time. So really great to have you. Of course, Warwick Powell is, you originally trained as a historian, didn't you, Warwick? If I'm not mistaken, but you're sort of an economist, commentator on geopolitics, business person, a fellow at the Taipei Institute and adjunct professor at QUT. And you have a great Substack at warwickpowell.substack. And how are you today?
I'm very well. All the better for being your guinea pig for this live. So let's see how we go together.
Yeah. So look, I was keen to talk about, I guess, at a meta level, if you like, the issue of the way in which the people have been learning over the last 6 months, I guess, partly in response to Trump, partly in response to the various conflicts and wars, the trade war as well, that, everything we've held dear and true about the world has proven not quite to be the case, that the United States, when it says jump, everyone doesn't always jump as high as they possibly can. And, the economy hasn't quite worked out the way it has. That was the case with the Ukraine war. And people are also questioning their sort of realist views of geopolitics because some of the behaviour of leadership elites just seems so mad. So that's the sort of meta-level question. But maybe if we start with the question of, will Australia fight the United States over China? This is a question I know I think you discussed with Brian Beletic and KJ No earlier today or last night or whatever, and also with Glenn Deason in recent times as well. And it's clearly a bit of a hot issue at the moment in Australia, understandably. If I were to ask you the blunt question, do you think Australia would actually fight China if the US asked us to over the question of Taiwan?
Well, the disconcerting answer to that question is I don't know. I'd much rather be able to say definitively no, but I don't know, and I say that because Australia has a long history of gallivanting across the world, fighting other people's wars under all sorts of pretexts, and so if that historical form continues to play a role in the ways in which the Australian political elite think about its role in the world, its role in warfare, and how that integrates Australia into a security environment offered by a great protector somewhere or another, then there is, I think, some risk, of course, that Australia will be dragged into a conflict. The other thing I think that's interesting about the Australian ecosystem, Jeff, is not simply the historical dimensions, but institutionally going to war in Australia is the decision of one person. And there are, I think, reasonable concerns across the Australian community, particularly from those advocating for war reform, that a decision about war is not one that should be vested in the office of one individual. In some ways, of course, it's not fair on that individual concerned, but it also means that there is not a broader sense of accountability as to what's going on behind a decision to go to war. And so there is, I think, some good reasons for people to be advocating for war reform, demanding at a minimum that the Australian Parliament as a whole is required to give authority for the nation itself to go to war. So, look, on that broad question, I don't know. And as I said, it's a disconcerting way of approaching it. It's one that that at a personal level gives me a considerable amount of discomfort, because the idea of Australia traipsing off to war anywhere in the world and sending mainly young people off to get killed is a horrific thought. And it seems to me that we've lost in this whole discussion about will Australia go to war or not, the ability and the willingness to prioritise a different question, which is what is it that Australia can do in this part of the world that will actually contribute to not only the reduction of the risk of war, which is merely just a question of war avoidance, but what Australia can do to contribute to the construction of a lasting and institutionalized peace, right? And that, to me, seems to be the question that now goes unasked, and because we have become obsessed by this other question, which is will we or won't we go to war?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess in a way, to me, it sort of breaks down to at least two questions. One is what will Australia decide to do? And I guess the track record is not terribly encouraging there, given historical circumstances. However, there seems to be some evidence that maybe things are shifting. There's greater opposition given the stakes involved. But then the second question is, well, will America? I mean, I don't think it's a question that America is planning and preparing for war with China. I mean, that it's sort of been doing that for 80 years, kind of thing. But the question is, will they actually pull the trigger? And I guess that's the thing where I really don't know. And then I think, in a sense, it depends a little bit upon the circumstances and whatnot about whether they pull the trigger. I guess that whether Australia would actually decide to go. So maybe if we address the American question first. Do you think they'd actually be that mad to fight a potentially nuclear war with China?
Look, I think America does have a certain amount of madness in it, particularly when it comes to its own views about where it should sit in the hierarchy of the world and the hierarchy of human civilization. So, if anybody heard Senator Lindsey Graham over the last couple of days talking about his bone-crushing sanctions and Russia and China and India, the language that he used was about crushing other countries and their economies. And there is very clearly a deep-seated view in the American political elite that America not only has a right but an obligation and an ability to unilaterally enforce its will across the world. Now, in reality, that's not panning out the way that Americans who think like that would want. But all that's doing at the moment is causing them to double down, as opposed to reflect upon whether or not those objectives are reasonable, let alone whether or not the means can sustain those objectives. So that's the first thing. I think that there is, within the American body politic, certainly some ingredients that lends itself to this predilection to war. And in fact, there's been some American studies published a couple of years ago in a book called Dying by the Sword, the militarization of American foreign policy, which ultimately describes the United States as a country addicted to military intervention. So I think that there are some grounds to be concerned that that the American political elite would actually act in a kinetic and belligerent way. The second thing, though, and I think that this is an interesting feature of a context, and it goes more to tactics rather than broad structural intent, and that is how it is that America shapes the terrain of warfare. And it largely does that by, and increasingly does it by, preparing and arming proxies, taking half a step back to, in a sense, stay out of harm's way directly, and then generating tensions that ultimately seek to provoke a response from the counterparty. And it does that because it wants to say things like, we're here to defend peace and stability, and we've had aggression from so-and-so, which warrants our intervention. We've seen that in other parts of the world, and I suspect that this is the kind of game plan that the United States is continuing to prosecute within Asia as well. The last sort of broad comment, I guess, is that there are nonetheless some realities, and these are realities that countries like Australia, Philippines, Japan, Korea may wish to begin to reflect deeply and seriously about, and that is the extent to which the Americans will ultimately be able to deliver the kind of backstops that historically have been assumed as part of a war effort. And my own sense is that despite the fact that the United States continues to hold as a matter of strategic doctrine the ambition of projecting primacy and power across the entire globe, it actually doesn't have the means to do so anymore. And because it doesn't have the means to do so, it really puts a very big question mark on whether or not it will actually walk the walk. Now, that matters for everyone else who are going to be thrust to the front line in the first instance, because if the United States isn't actually going to be a meaningful kinetic backstop, then really you're going into bat for someone else where you're likely to get bludgeoned and have zero protection at all. So these are the big questions, I think, for Australia. In a paper that you published actually today, which I only just had a look at, you talked about the way that Curtin responded in 1941, and you reflected on the very specific context, which was the abyss of empire of the British Empire as the context for the shift to the United States. And the question I think that Australia really needs to be asking itself is, are we now on the cusp, or in fact deep in the midst of the 21st century version of the abyss of empire? And in this case, it's not the British Empire, but the American Empire. And if, in fact, we are in the midst of the abyss of the American Empire, then Australia is actually going to need to make another choice coming up at some point. And it is actually a choice to remove itself from empire and find its security in another direction.
Yeah. And I mean, just to explain all that a little bit more, of course, this is referring to the situation in 1941, 1942, 2 years into the European part of the Second World War, 10 years into the Asian side of the Second World War, in which Australia, John Curtin, the Australian Prime Minister, said, we look to America, free of our pangs of traditional ties with Britain. And it was said very much within a context of believing, I guess, that that the Britishness of Britain was special. It was, it was the mother of parliaments, the home of democracy, the most advanced industrial liberal civilization in the world. It was, if you like, a predecessor of the liberal rules-based order. And what happens is that, in late 41, early 1942, it's complete disaster for the Allies and specifically for the British Empire. They're being bombed in Britain. Germany controls most of Europe. Operation Barbarossa is being launched. And in December 41, Pearl Harbor happens, but not just Pearl Harbor, but, Malaysia, Burma, Japan controls most of coastal China. So it is effectively Britain. And then in February 42, Singapore, the sort of impregnable fortress, falls, and effectively Britain loses its Asian empire. And this is what the historian John Darwin describes as the strategic abyss. So it's in this context that John Curtin sort of, stands up to Churchill and looks to America. He really didn't have a whole lot of choice. Britain was basically on its knees. It wasn't a great thing. And over the course of the war, what he does is develop a concept of transitioning to a fourth British Empire to revive British imperial power post-war, but an empire in which the dominions, the white dominions of Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Canada, have more power and influence, and specifically for Australia in the South Pacific. Effectively, the terms that you've often used in interviews, that Australia would act as a sub-imperial power within the British Empire. And so to interpret Curtin as, this brave nationalist who, turns away from imperial great power projects is really quite false. And I wonder if really we can interpret Albanese-Xi's recent speech in similar terms, that he's imagining a kind of a better American empire that's more committed to, what America used to be like, supposedly, and in which places like Australia have more influence. So yes, we'll do all the things, but we expect a little bit more in return than perhaps what you're giving us at the moment. So yeah, it's an interesting. I think it's a really interesting comparison, and the war's obviously not going to be like World War II, but there are people who, like Dimitri Tenin, who are saying we are actually now in a kind of a World War III situation with multiple conflicts around the world across different domains. So,
look, I think that for the Australian position, the pivotal question, and in fact, I think it's the one that's plaguing the public debate now, even if it often sits in the recesses of the discursive terrain, the cultural and debate context, is this question of whether or not we are in the middle or at the beginning, or perhaps even heading towards the end of the unfolding of the strategic abyss of the American empire. And it is that question that ultimately animates the various positions that are now becoming quite apparent in the Australian polity. So, on the one hand, we have Hugh White, who has clearly come to a view that the American empire is over in Asia, that primacy is lost. primacy won't be regained, and we are now entering into new waters, and a new approach is necessary. You have others who still hold on to the prospects that whilst empire may not be as dominant as it once was, nonetheless, the United States is in a position and continues to be willing to play an important and perhaps even a quasi dominant role in Asia as a quote balancing force unquote, so as to mitigate the risks of a claimed Chinese hegemony emerging. And we've seen that kind of argument unfold recently in an opinion piece from a very senior member of the Australian foreign policy establishment, Peter Varghese. My own read of that particular opinion piece is that it represents a significant shift from a position that Varghese has held for a long time, which was a long-standing supporter of both the rules-based international order on the one hand, and of course Australia's role as a defender and beneficiary of that, and the acknowledgement that a certain kind of American retrenchment, together with a rise of China. So these are relative questions, right? So balance of power is a relative question, not just an absolute question, has changed the terrain. So you've got that sort of view. Then you've got the we are going to have to fight tooth and nail to rebuild American primacy because we can't afford the alternative. So whatever that alternative is, we can't afford it. It's no good. And we are literally just going to have to double down on whatever it is that the Americans want, insofar as America maintains its doctrine of primacy across all domains in the world. And that debate is, I think, now setting the backdrop to how the diplomacy is articulated. So you see very difficult choices of words and turns of phrases now emerging to try to navigate this space without giving too much away. And of course, there is this appeal to the emotional dimensions of citizenship, which seeks to, in some respects, bypass this very awkward question and at least for a moment make citizens feel that they have in a sense escaped the dilemma of the decline of the American empire. Because we are ultimately a free agent. Now, that's not true. No nation is free per se. We're always intertwined with what's going on in the world around us. But nonetheless, as political rhetoric's concerned, it may buy some good grace in the community. It may buy or create some space for maneuver, but this question can't be avoided forever.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, just as an example of that, and maybe a demonstration that some of the war hawks in Australia are not that clever politically. We have I can't remember whether he was Defence Secretary ever, but he was the head of the Homeland Security Department, or whatever it was, Home Affairs in Australia, Michael Pizzullo, and very, very strident war hawk in Australia. And he's published a piece in the think tank of strident war hawks, ASPI, Australian Strategic Policy Institute, where he basically sort of rains on the parade of anyone who thinks Australia's got any sovereignty at all, and says, since Australia hosts US facilities, we need a joint war plan. And here he says that, you're kidding yourself, folks. We're part of this war now. We don't have a choice. We have Pine Gap. We have all these other things. I think John Menadue, the distinguished former public servant and editor of Pearls and Irritations, or former editor of founder and former editor of Pearls and Irritations, has said effectively Northern Australia has become a kind of a American military colony. So Michael Pizzullo is certainly not allowing any sort of lily-livered people who actually want peace and prosperity in the world to sort of back out of this war with China.
It also bells the cat in a very interesting and important way, because it actually reminds people that Australia has long been imbricated in the American power network in the region, and that has always circumscribed the extent to which Australia has any sense of autonomy when it really matters. And of course, the question of autonomy or sovereignty really matters when it comes to a question of engaging in war, right? That is the ultimate question of sovereignty. Do you enter into a war with someone else? Other issues that you might decide upon, policy issues, whether they're economic, social, cultural, or what have you, are nowhere near the same order of significance insofar as the question of sovereignty is concerned as this question of war. And Pizzullo's piece literally bells the cat. It does say, Australia is part of the American war network, its infrastructure, its capabilities, and then he opens up, or at least makes an argument, which is a normative argument. And this is where people can, I think, start to see how the debate will unfold. So Pizzullo's argument is, well, given these realities, we're in the war, and therefore we really just should have a joint war plan. That's a normative view, which is about Australia's role in this, empire network. There is an alternative normative view which people can develop, actually making use of Pizzullo's belling of the cat, which is, and Pizzullo's piece that you actually just showed talked about this. If Australia doesn't want to be a belligerent, it needs to get rid of all of this stuff. Now, of course, his normative view is, heaven forbid that we contemplate that, and in fact, we shouldn't. But I think that there is a growing sense across the Australian community that this question must be asked. We cannot sustain a position that just accepts that we are going to be dragged along as a de facto willing war proxy partner without at least asking these very, very hard questions. And this is why I think the big backdrop issue is this empire already in the abyss or not? And if it is, and actually I don't think many people genuinely dispute the fact that it is somewhere in this abyss spectrum, right? It's just a question of how far down it is. Given that it is already experiencing strategic abyss, the question I wonder is do people seriously believe that Australia, no matter what it does, can contribute to the turning around of the descent? And unless you can prove convincingly, let's assume that you think this is a good thing to do, right? Unless you can prove convincingly that you can meaningfully turn the descent around. Right? So, when an aeroplane goes into a death spiral, you can't pull out, you can't pull up. Doesn't matter what you do. And I think that there's an argument to be had, which is that, look, the American airline has gone into the death spiral and it's going down into the abyss as a primate. It's a big country, big economy. It's clearly an influential actor in the world. It's just that it can't be a primate in a unilateral way. And once those presuppositions go, the entire terrain of Australian decision making fundamentally transforms. And in fact, we are back at a curtain moment, right? But it's not quite the way that I think Prime Minister Albanese's speech implied or sought to mobilise curtain for. But nonetheless, the context is not dissimilar. Facing the abyss of the old protector, a new path must be selected.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I'm putting out a video on the weekend on going a bit more into Curtin and the strategic abyss. And, people should remind themselves that Churchill said he fought World War II to keep the British Empire going for a few more generations. And by 1947, India had left. By 1956, they were ruined in Suez. And it sort of limped on sadly into the 60s and 70s, even you could say to 1999 in Hong Kong.
In fact, I would
some would say it's still going today in Cyprus and Gibraltar and Falkland Islands.
Perhaps just in the minds and the imaginations of those in Whitehall.
Yeah.
But there is no doubt, I think, that to some extent the British elite still conduct themselves as if they are an empire. And I don't think anyone else treats that particularly seriously. But nonetheless, put aside the fact that the empire actually doesn't exist in any objective sense, I think the mentality in Whitehall still carries on as if there's something of empire there.